been involved in ID in the past, but in the past 2 or 3 years, I've been full-time working at Transport for London on the converting the Oyster card to accept contactless payment cards. So I'm John Elliott from Consult Hyperion, and I recognise a few of you from the ID world from when I used to do lots of European and government contracts, and I'm back doing that now again. So I have the joy of chairing the 2 sessions this afternoon. If I can characterise this morning as being covering the situation as it is now, I think the next 2 panels, the next one's about what gaps are there, and then the final one's about, what are we going to see in the future. So I'm going to hand over straight away to our first speaker, who's Sam Hill from Tesco.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for welcoming me here this afternoon. I'm not part of this group. I'm not part of any government organisation. I just work for Tesco. You probably all know who Tesco are. And I was invited to come along and give some sort of outsider viewpoints and experience of what users perceive around identity and our learnings from the industry. Some of what I'll express here is sort of personal viewpoints. Some of it is sort of some Tesco information that's a bit muddled together. But I just wanted to give a sort of a general sort of feeling of the perspective around what identity means. And you'll be pleased to know I haven't got any PowerPoint slides, so this should be a quicker, smoother run through. And I just want to sort of reflect firstly on this morning and just sort of say some of the sessions I found a little challenging, shall we say, around where we're sort of taking identity at this pace that the governments are moving at. I found John's session, sort of John Bradley, yours quite insightful actually, around how actually around mobile, coming from commercial space myself, seeing that change. It's a very similar perspective I'm going to probably bring, so try not to be controversial, but I think there's some challenges that need to be looked into. I mean, biggest challenge that we all have actually, governments, corporations, small businesses, is identifying our customers. It's the biggest challenge we all face, and allowing customers to register with just a simple website is actually quite a challenge. The number of people who drop out on that registration form is actually surprisingly high. And then getting those customers to keep that credential secure is even harder. And getting the customer to do that is, quite a challenge. I quite like the idea of a sort of a European identity. There's only one of me, so single identity per customer across Europe or even globally. A single way of signing into sites, to systems, will make life a lot easier. Certainly solve a lot of the security issues. I mean, I come from Tesco, it's a fairly dominant company. We've got 50% of the UK e-commerce market. That's pretty good. We've rolled that model out into Ireland, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary in Europe. And every time we've done that, we've asked those customers to go and re-register again. Even though they've registered with countless other websites, probably registered with their local governments and all the rest of it. And it's quite a challenge getting customers to just go through that process, as I said. And we have to recognise that customers are mobile. So all of our European websites actually share credentials. You can go and register on any of them and then go to a different one, and your identity will follow you across all of those sites. And that's not just the grocery ones, that's actually with our general merchandising websites and our clothing websites, which are all international. Because we're trying to get to that point where there is just one identity for the customers with Tesco. It works so much easier for those customers. And the ability to link into something central here can really help. Facebook offer theirs, and John mentioned this earlier as well, about Google as well. There's lots of commercial companies that are offering sort of identities. Can they validate to probably the level that governments are after? Probably not yet. Should the government be building its own one or working with other partners to do it? It comes down to that trust and challenge around customers. Do they trust, as was challenged this morning around those e-commerce designs, a little Experian logo or a sign up with Verizon or equivalents? Where's the trust come in? And reflecting on that is, you'll probably recall in the news this year about Tesco and passwords and how apparently in February 2,200 accounts were hacked. They weren't hacked. Well, they weren't hacked on Tesco, certainly. What happened was customers used the same usernames and passwords across lots of websites. A small company website was broken into. They took their database, they fired all those credentials at Tesco, and for 2,500 of them, or 2,200 of them, they happened to match. The challenge is, though, that customers see that as the corporation's problem, the big business's problem, that they've actually shared their credentials. It's how do you then push that duty of care back to the customers, actually, that it's their job to protect their data, We can do everything we can. So at Tesco, we've increased our security. We have always encrypted passwords. We've always protected card data as sensitively as we can. But if the customers use the same username and password everywhere, it's not going to be that much more secure. And if you start putting in 2 factors in around your mobile phone, people change their phones, people move about. It's all very difficult. And we have to sort of reflect a little bit on the user's behaviour that's driven that. The world's changed a lot. In the world I'm in, it's all about the culture of immediacy. Customers want to do things here, now, shop straight away. People don't ponder information anymore. They just want the information at their fingertips. They don't stop, they just go. There's a big challenge around smart boredom. I see people in here are playing on their phones, on their laptops. You're probably a bit bored. You're probably trying to do multiple things at the same time. You do the same on the train. We did some research a little while ago. It showed about 40% of people shop when they're on the toilet because you're sat there. It falls into that smart boredom category. It's, let's go and get a few more items on our shopping. There's the brainstorming at bedtime concept that's related to that as well, around, people don't just sit in bed reading books, people sit in beds playing on their phones and their iPads, again, continuing to shop, continuing to interact and do things differently. The world really has shifted, and especially with the internet generation, the concept of security about sharing or not sharing their credentials is all very, very different to the world 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and the industry needs to really reflect that. And I say the industry meaning the broad IT industry, including everyone else who's playing around with identities. And again, from Tesco, we see customers shop on a huge number of devices. 30% of our sales are now on tablets or mobile apps and that sort of thing. And of the customers who are using website, over half of them now are using, again, mobile phones, mobile apps. So the world really is shifting. It's not about websites anymore, actually. It's about just different ways, different channels. And reflecting on that, customers change their order 18 times with us for groceries these days. So they will book a slot, and then they'll continually go through that smart boredom phase on the toilet, adding items to their basket, building up their shopping as they go. Because that's how people are now. And so having an identity credential that you use with a government site once a year, you'll probably forget that. Or you'll use really weak credentials, and it's how can you actually make that effective, make that secure for customers, bring that trust in? It's going to be a really difficult thing. I quite like, to be honest, I applaud, as I said, the idea of a single ID for a customer, because there is only one of you, but it needs to be done in a very good way. And from a Tesco perspective, it would help as well, because then we can identify all of our customers uniquely without having them register multiple times across the channels, across different businesses. It really would help with KYC, know your customer, all the fraud, loss prevention, all of the big security challenges that industries generally face could all help to be combated. So I'd say there's a lot of benefits to it, but there's a lot of challenges to get there. And I do worry that 2018, as was shown on the slide earlier, about when this gets implemented, if it's going to be too little, far too late. That's me and my thoughts.
Sam, thanks very much. I should have said at the beginning, I just discovered the pile of biographies on the table here. So I should have said that Sam is the head of solution architecture at Tesco with 20 years of experience, and I'm sure if you have a chat with him later on, he can tell you much more about himself. But we've got an hour to fill here with 4 speakers, so I would propose that we try and take some questions immediately after people have spoken, rather than leaving it all till the end, to try and keep them specific. Are there any specific questions for Sam right now? I've got one.
Go on.
I was just wondering, you talked about this, wanting a European ID, and we are one person, therefore we should have one ID. Who do you think might provide this? What sort of organisation do you think might provide this, especially in the UK, where it's not going to be government?
I think the easiest way to answer that indirectly is sort of the market will answer it itself. It's the usual sort of supply-demand. Whichever technology, whichever one wins out, will be the one that becomes that. The question then becomes how you validate it and how you drive your levels of trust around it. So, like John was sort of saying earlier about the sort of the mobile one, where you could use your mobile phone to validate yourself. That's something we've looked at Tesco, getting people to scan their phones, use QR codes on it, Wave Pay. There's so many different competing technologies and things to identify. It's just, how do you go about building up that profile, building up that trust? And it's all down to trust levels. So you may end up registering lots of different bits, and then it's any combination of those, it becomes your European identity, becomes who you are. And it's whichever set of those you present at different times becomes it. having a single sort of identity card or a sort of one or two providers that go through different processes, I'm not sure is actually necessarily going to win out in the end. Competitive markets, the way technology changes, will drive things. Look at the dominance of Google or Facebook or some of the others. Things will drive up and bubble up. That'll be what the winner will be.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. I remember quite a few years ago, people used to talk about telcos would be the answer to this, and now a lot of people are saying banks are going to be the answer to this, but maybe we'll see. Yes, question over there.
Contrasting point of view, I'm told that a couple of weeks ago there was a federal hearing in the States on ID, and Google was saying, oh, well, our identity systems are wonderful, they should be used for federal purposes. And the chairman of the committee revealed that she had over 80 Google identities, some of them created because she couldn't use the previous one, others created because she did not want that shared across other parts of Google. Should not the customer have a choice as to whether they have single identity or multiple identities, and which is shared with whom?
Can't disagree with you. You see it yourselves. People will have one or two accounts probably with Tesco because they will do some shopping on behalf of the company they work for, or they'll do some shopping for themselves. But ultimately, it still ends up being the same identity and the same person. It's sort of how well do you trust that person? We use it for different sort of fraud scoring and other things about what level of risk we want to accept around orders.
Sam, you mentioned an incident where hackers got into a store and stole a site and stole usernames and passwords. The problem that many individuals use the same user ID and password on many different sites. If you have a single identity provider providing ID services for a large range of organisations, how would you prevent that problem from getting even worse? Whereby multiple actors in one location and get free reign over multiple sites.
That comes down to if it's done properly anyway, so it's all down to individual implementations, but if you're using a single identity provider sort of centrally and it's federated out to them, then apart from the sort of local sort of e-commerce website or government would just act as a sort of a broker or a gateway through to it, they shouldn't actually store or maintain those credentials. So if any individual site was compromised, you may get an OAuth token that's expired or a SAML token or whatever technology they're using, but those only valid for 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time. So your scope window there is small. If, however, one of the big identity providers themselves were compromised, then the impacts and risk and ramifications of that could be enormous. Because if it's, it could happen today. For example, with Facebook, lots of websites use Facebook to allow you to log into. If Facebook were compromised, then those usernames and passwords could be everywhere.
I think we've got time if there is one more question. I think I saw a hand back. Is there any more questions? Okay, well, let's thank Sam for the talk. And we'll move on to our next speaker.
Yeah, we have known each other a long while. It's been a long journey, and from what I've heard this morning, there's still a way to go yet. I've been asked just to say a few words on do the banks need to do more? And there is, I'm pleased to say, one banker in this room from Lloyds Banking Group. In some ways, it's a pity they're not a great deal more. The banks should be in this space enormously, I believe. So yes, the banks could do more, should do more, and perhaps will do more in the digital identity space. And I'd just like to take a tiny bit of time, not many slides, just to talk through why the banks even thought about digital identity in the first place and why it matters enormously in the 21st century for them and for their customers. And I tend to refer to something called Gall's Law. And the Trust Network, which IdenTrust administers on behalf of banks and their customers globally, is, I think, a very good illustration of Gall's Law. A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. And the inverse also appears to be true. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be made to work. You've got to start over again and beginning with a simple system. So I'm a simple banker by background, and I've worked in the clearing banks and so on around the world, and have looked at the way in which checks and money, checks and plastic card networks and all the things that we take for granted in day-to-day life actually operate. And they all operate according to a pre-agreed set of rules which defines the liabilities, the obligations, the rights and entitlements of each and every person within that network. Whether it's me writing out a check or whether it's someone giving a check to me. It's two-way, and each of us have to abide by a certain set of processes. Even when we're using our plastic cards, we each have to abide by a set of processes. Now, all of us in day-to-day life take that for granted, that it just happens. We go to Starbucks or anywhere else and buy our coffee, or we buy a house, or whatever we might be doing. Money moves, value moves across electronic networks. And it's an area, I think, politically that is very important for politicians to try to grasp, because politicians have historically, certainly over the last, 6 years since the great financial crash, have picked up the Daily Mail, and I use that as an example, and everything about banks is shock horror. Bankers' bonuses and fraud and Forex and LIBOR and the interest rates swap agreements, all those kind of things that hit the headlines. But years ago I was talking to a very distinguished banker called Sir Kit McMahon, who was Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, and he was also Chairman of Midland Bank at the time. And he said, if you actually look at banks in three distinctive circles, as it were, three distinctive areas, you can start to understand what the banking business is all about. And he said the first of those circles is the capital markets. So wholesale capital markets, things that quote-unquote investment banks do. The second of those areas is the commercial banking business, the business of lending money and accepting deposits and those sort of things. And the third area that Sir Kit identified all those years ago was what I would call operational risk, which is the whole payments networks that operate globally. And I would put it to politicians today that actually the first two of those circles have indeed caused very real problems over the last few years and have rightly drawn all sorts of criticism and hopefully jail sentences and big fines and so on for some of the shenanigans that went on. But despite all those, and despite the crash and everything else that happened in 2008, the actual payments networks stayed intact and they worked. And I think that's something that everybody in this room should remember and bear in mind when we start to look at the role of banks and of frameworks in the digital world that we're now in. And of course, the internet is the ultimate in electronic networks. And actually, a payment is something that sits at the end of every single transaction. So for me, the logic of reusing what the banks already do is actually very compelling. And from a bank's perspective, the logic of doing that is actually it starts to reinvent the real relevance of a bank in the 21st century. Because actually, I believe if banks don't own identity, they will be like the frogs in the saucepan as the water gently heats up. And they'll wake up one day and find that somebody else is doing the lending of money and accepting of deposits, somebody else is doing capital markets activities, and lo and behold, my core business of payments and this, that, the other has gone as well because I don't own the identity piece. I also think that some of the challenges coming out of regulation of the payments area are things that people ought to be concerned about. There are coming out of Europe certain moves to give the likes of Google and Facebook direct access into bank accounts. Now, to me, that is something that is truly scary, because the banks exist because their networks are trusted. And I think you only have to pick up the newspaper from last week and look at the article around, this is called "With Great Power Comes Great Responsibility." And this was about the poor soldier who got stabbed and the whole role of Facebook is, in this case, in that environment. And if you happen to read The Spectator this week, there is a very good, and I would recommend you buy it and read it, page 15, there's an article called Technology Without Responsibility. And it is again zeroing in on the fact that enormous technology companies, global in reach, way outside of anything that the European Union out of Brussels can do, let alone out of London, to actually regulate them in a realistic format, that technology without responsibility is potentially a very dangerous thing for society, whereas technology with responsibility, with liability, does actually start to bring accountability in all the things that we really need in society for those things that actually matter day to day, which would then frankly leave law enforcement able to look at the things that really are spooky on the other side. So I'm saying that yes, there is a big role for banks in the digital identity space. There's a big role for interoperability among bank-issued credentials. There is no point at all in one bank having one solution, another bank having another solution, and another bank across the channel or the other side of the world having another solution if each of them don't talk. It's just like the old store card era of plastic cards, where all of us in this room would have had a shed load of different cards, and then Visa and MasterCard came along, we actually could use that credential anywhere we wanted. So there is an argument to be made that yes, banks should and could do more and hopefully will do more as they reinvent their relevance, and that B, they will do so under some sort of common recognised liability model where each of them know when they start out what they're on the hook for and what their customers are on the hook for, and equally what they are not on the hook for in terms of liabilities and entitlements and so on. So to me, it's been a very long journey, and it's still got a long way to go. And I was very interested in all the talk on the role of mobile operators and so on. But still, the role of the banker in know your customer and in being a highly regulated entity is something that is pretty unique. Everybody has bank accounts, whether you're in business or whether you're a citizen. You have a bank account, and the bank has essentially done the KYC. So my view is that that should be leveraged enormously, and that it actually offers an enormous opportunity for example, the British government to lead the way in the use of bank-issued credentials under the IDAP program or whatever it evolves. So that's my pennyworth on is there a role for banks in this topic.
Thanks, John. I haven't got a microphone, I can hear me. But I just wanted to ask, before I open to the floor, you used the liability word, which is one of my favourite ones.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've been involved in that for a long time, but in this modern world of identity, how do you see liability working? Because in my experience, banks address liability by trying to avoid it or pass it on to somebody else. So how do you think that
No, I mean, banks are, I mean, in any clearing system, banks have a liability to their customers and to other members of a system. And I would regard something like what we do at IdenTrust as a clearing mechanism. It is a mechanism that has liabilities with it. And whether you are talking about access to the cloud or storage of data in the cloud or any of these kind of trendy technological phrases, the principles are still the same. 100 years ago, your grandfather and my grandfather would have kept things that mattered to him in Captain Mannering's branch. And he would have gone through a series of processes to deposit them and to withdraw them when he wanted. Now, I would put to you that precisely the same sort of concept should be being thought about by the world's banks today to store things that matter electronically to their customers. Whether it's in the cloud or wherever else is by and large, up to technology gurus, much cleverer than me to decide. But the principles are basically the same.
Okay, thanks. So, anybody got a question for John?
Here's a mic.
I have an observation. I'm a banker as well.
Yeah.
10 years ago, the banks managed to kill off the concept of bank account aggregation on the internet. You will remember that, where services were offered on the internet where you could see all of your bank accounts in one screen, which meant, of course, disclosing your access codes and your pins and card pins to that service. And the banks immediately said, well, if you do that, then we will accept no liability for any loss of money. Mm-hmm. And that killed it straight away. And the same applies if you want to give your bank credentials to Facebook. You'd be nuts. I mean, you just don't do that.
And if you do, more fool you, and if you lose the money, tough luck.
Well, I would say, I would agree, and if you come along to CSFI next Tuesday, to the lunchtime meeting of CSFI, there's a lady called Ruth Vonderhofer of City talking about this very issue of the done largely under competition law at the political level in Europe, of these sorts of outfits having direct access into the bank's payment systems and what that potentially entails. So it is a very topical issue even today.
I mean, what we really need in those instances, in terms of liability, is for someone to sue these third parties, be it Facebook or whoever else, sue them for a hell of a lot of money.
Well,
Any more questions for John?
One other aspect which we don't talk about that much that the banks may actually have a fair amount of leverage with is the whole issue of legacy. People are putting a lot more value into electronic credentials that access things that have financial savings and other things around the internet, your photo library of your children, etc. Having a trusted credential provider that at the same time, if you happen to die, which most people do eventually, having someone to actually administer, on proof of a death certificate when your estate is being transferred, transfer access to those accounts to trusted family members, etc. I'm starting to see some services around the world trying to get into that, but I think there's an interesting, given that banks have to deal with that anyways for transfer of assets, there may be additional leverage for banks becoming trusted service providers because they have that perhaps more established methodology for dealing with those situations?
I think, John, I would agree, and I think there are. I mean, one of the reasons it's been such a long journey, certainly in what you might call the developed world, I think, is because there's so much embedded legacy systems in the major banks today. And actually, I think it's quite interesting, and I was talking to Sam earlier on, for outfits like him, who, Tesco run a bank. It is a regulated financial services entity. And everybody uses, or as he's just said, a vast number of people use their Tesco's store and their Tesco's card pretty much every day. So there are opportunities for banks that haven't necessarily got legacy stuff to actually catch up pretty quick in this space, and I think some are starting to do it. But your point about legacy is very true.
Well, let's thank John for talking. And next we have Louise Bennett from the BCS.
No.
And Louise is chair of the BCS Security Community of Expertise. And she's going to be talking about challenges and opportunities for identity and attribute providers.
Okay. I personally believe that if the web had an extensible identity and payment mechanism as part of its absolutely core architecture, there'd be enormous value to everyone in this room as individuals. But to get to that point, there are two key questions to answer, and they've been touched on by some of the speakers this morning and before me here. First is, can different personal views and national legal requirements about liability, security, traceability, privacy, and anonymity actually be reconciled? And we've been talking almost all the time today about Europe and the Western world. That's only a very small part of the world. This is a global problem. And second, following on from what John said, can you distill a really simple core identity and payment requirement specification? And these two issues really concern our need for trust and our appetite for risk. So identity, I think, is inextricably bound up with trust, and trust is absolutely vital for online payments. And controversially, because I've had large arguments about this with a number of people, I think everyone should accept that both individuals and businesses need to be identified and not anonymous in online transactions involving what I would call legitimate payments. And I've had arguments with Bitcoin enthusiasts, etc., about this. I also think we need really simple ways to ensure that contractual liabilities are clear and that they're understood by all parties. And you were talking about the desire for instant gratification. That means no one reads the terms and conditions. And so they have no idea who has the liability. And I'd like to consider 3 levels of transaction, and I'm not going to spend much time on the top 2, and I just call them for simplicity's sake high, medium and low. A high-value transaction, it would be an individual purchasing something like a house or a business buying all its stock in for Christmas. These are transactions where the purchaser has a very, very low tolerance for risk. And in almost all cases, certainly in the Western world, but also in other parts of the world, these transactions would normally go through a bank because they have a trusted system and everyone is pretty confident that they're not going to be bankrupted by this transaction going wrong. And I'm not going to say any more about it than that. If we take a medium value transaction, and for the audience here, a medium value transaction might be something like buying electronic equipment or an airfare. And I would say that probably most of the people in this room would choose to use a credit card for that transaction. And we choose to use a credit card even if it costs us a little bit more because we know where the liability lies, because we know that the liability lies, as far as we're concerned, with the credit card company. The credit card company charges enough for that transaction to cover all the fraudulent use of that card. And if the fraudulent use gets too high, they increase the charges until there's a balance that everyone is prepared to accept in the marketplace. And again, I'm not going to continue with that one. It's the low-value transactions. And those are the transactions where our appetite for risk is higher that really cause the most problems. I realise that I've chosen the wrong example here, but I'll do it nonetheless because men buy cosmetics now. But in the electronic world, we may want to buy some cosmetics. And we may want to do that in an online store because we're attracted by the promise of how much more beautiful it's going to make us look, how younger, how it's going to make us feel, and so on. When they arrive, they may not live up to expectations, and that's if they arrive at all. The cost was only small for us, so we didn't look at the T's and C's, we didn't do anything like that. And we didn't realise there was no refund policy. That's if they've arrived. And we didn't realise we were buying perhaps from an online company with a name very similar to the high street store we intended to buy from and we trusted. And in fact, they're a company in some other country. So nothing ever arrives. Now, this may just teach us a nice lesson about being careful in the future, or it may completely erode our trust in online shopping because we've been fooled by fraudulent identities. So existing banks and cards can be the basis for lots of international mitigation of risks and so on for medium and high payments and for those lower payments. And there are lots of people who would say, and I'm not sure John was actually saying this, that we should get all of the world's unbanked to use banks and then it would all be fine. But I just remind you that about half the world's adult population, 2.5 billion people, are unbanked. If we get them into the banking system, their transactions would all be safe. But that's an incredibly expensive solution. Other means, like mobile wallets, phone payments, are far more suitable for those small payments and will probably become the key things for low-value transactions. And again, I hope with this audience, I'm going to move to the unbanked world. You probably all know about M-Pesa. It's a form of mobile money. It's now used by 75% of Kenyan adults. Estimates say that about half Kenya's GDP actually flows through M-Pesa. Money is sent from phone to phone using simple text messaging. In poor countries where people earn $1 a day, a dollar note is an inconveniently large sum for buying vegetables, sending money home to your family, or paying a friend for help. And there's little or no coinage often in a lot of these countries. So $1 paid to an agent, which is shown in this picture, for a mobile phone company, turned into mobile money and divided up into very small units, works really, really well. And it's happening in other countries, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And this extends financial services to the unbanked, rather than bringing them into any kind of mainstream banking system. Now, I think the activities of M-Pesa and all sorts of similar services, they're spawning new financial services from microcredit to remittances. But at present, they lack a single worldwide open source infrastructure to support them. I think if open standards existed, it would make low-value global e-commerce transactions really viable. It could make purchases from payments to SMEs and startups really simple and feasible. It could cover all those M-Pesa type transactions and such things as peer-to-peer sharing of a meal bill, irrespective of which mobile phone company all the participants subscribe to. And in fact, the World Wide Web Consortium has just agreed to build an open standard for identity and payments. The requirement specification is being devised now, and I would urge all of you who are interested in this to get involved as BCS are doing. Some of the basic thoughts about what's involved in the W3C payment and identity standards are shown here. Mozilla is one of the leading lights at the moment. And the new standards, I think, have a lot of implications for the business models of banks, of telcos, and mobile wallet providers. At present, the key attributes are that it will be royalty-free to work with web architecture. It will be a decentralized ID with a secure digital signature and web key encryption. My own personal views are that we should consider that any financial transaction in either the physical or the online world, there's a chance of being cheated. And we need to start online, exactly as John said, with something really simple that works. Bells and whistles shouldn't be considered in a basic standard. An identity standard on the internet must also allow for multiple identities, which you were talking about, Philip. Organizations and individuals need to be able to assert their identities from many different places and devices. And all the surveys and the research that we in the BCS and others have done have shown that individuals want to use multiple identities. A PayPal identity, a Facebook identity, several different bank cards and phone identities. Similarly, some businesses and organizations are going to want to assert different identities in different jurisdictions where their terms of service can reflect local customs and laws. So businesses and people all want several different identities. I think we also have to accept that you can't provide 100% security. You have to balance usability, as we were looking at this morning, with security and consider the risks involved in every type of transaction to all the parties who are involved. In online transactions, there's often a trusted third party, like Alipay, standing in escrow for Alibaba transactions, PayPal or a bank, as John has described, a payment card being a trusted intermediary. In the physical world, most of us know how to get redress if we're cheated. We know the consumer rights we have in our home country. In the online world, we face much, much more uncertainty. And standards are needed to reduce that uncertainty and extend online payments safely to all people everywhere, banked or unbanked. The focus for all transactions involving online payments needs to be on building trust between the parties, as was said this morning, and ensuring that contractual liabilities are clear and the means of redress are effective. Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. Everyone's being very good with timing here. We've actually got a bit spare time. So John's given me the nod over there, so John's got a question.
I'll almost just make three comments. I think that it was back in 1999, at the very start of IdenTrust, that our General Counsel gave a presentation to UNCITRAL, to the International Law Forum in San Francisco, and went through the different formats of national legislation versus contract law for the internet. And I think the mere fact that we're still here in 2014 talking about nation-state law, digital signatures, et cetera, is indicative that of the point that our General Counsel was making way back then, that it's rather like waiting for Godot, waiting for nation-state laws to align totally around electronic signatures, digital signatures, and all the rest of it. Much the best and most effective way is the law of contract between parties, which essentially is what card schemes are all about. They're not about nation-state law, they're about so that's the first point. I do think contract law is the way forward on that. The other point I'd make for Louise is that I don't in any way mean that all the world's got to have a bank account. There's no way that what I propose is actually is quite. Of course, there are different horses for different courses, but actually, an awful lot of people have got bank accounts, and therefore, it's a good way to start. And I think the third thing is on the W3C payments standards initiative, which I think is very exciting. It is, however, a technology-driven initiative. So what you need sitting behind it is a scheme-based approach that can adopt that standard as and when the members of the scheme want it to be adopted. And people like John in the back there will be the people who will check the rules and the regulations and the compliance of something like that initiative coming into a broader trust framework.
Okay, Louise, do you want to say anything back or not?
John and I have talked about this a lot. I was trying to be a bit provocative, but it's quite true. But I think it's very important not to forget the unbanked. I mean, people were talking, even with the ID scheme in this country, there are unbanked in this country, and there is a question of how they can get involved and get approved identities if it's going to look at things like credit ratings, which such people don't have. So I think it's a very important thing to consider.
Okay, thanks. Now I do have a microphone, but only until I give it to this chap over here who has a question for Louise.
Yes, Louise, you mentioned that people should be allowed to have multiple identities, but can you expand on that a little bit? I got the feeling you were talking about multiple sets of credentials, which is not quite the same thing. And it goes to the point we were talking about earlier, what it defines identity.
Well, for example, I'm not alone among married women in having two very distinct identities, my married identity at home and my professional identity in my maiden name. It causes me enormous problems in trying to get an ID thing through the ID scheme on account of my bank account and my passport are not in the same names. And that's a very normal thing among women. I don't think I'm schizophrenic, but I do consider that I have two identities. And I think even if you aren't a married woman, you think of your identity at home being different from your identity at work. For example, I mean, you were saying sometimes you're buying things for your company. So you're buying things as a person in a particular position who's allowed to buy things. Another time, you're buying things for yourself. And those are different things. Those, in terms of wanting to do payments on the internet, need to be considered as different identities. Sometimes, if you're a company secretary, you're doing things, a very specific number of things for that company with that identity. So I think people do have different identities. It's not a different root identity, but it is a totally legitimate different identity for doing different types of transactions in different situations.
You introduced a new term there, root identity, which is because my wife's the same. She doesn't share my name, but her passport's in her own name anyway, so that particular problem doesn't arise. But I guess playing the devil's advocate and being the other person on the end of a transaction, you want to know who you're dealing with because you may be afraid of repudiation. Or you want to know who to sue or who to shoot in those circumstances. And I just wonder how we deal with those situations. And maybe your concept of a root identity is one step beyond that.
In fact, you can, for instance, in the UK, I mean, some countries in Europe don't allow you to have multiple identities. In the UK, you can actually list other identities you're known by on your passport. And that way, you are linking those other identities you use to your root identity. But you wouldn't personally probably want to link your identity in a particular position in a company, authorised to make certain payments or to do certain legal things, necessarily with your own root identity. But you can link them together. In this country, we're allowed to. In some countries, as I say, you're not allowed to. I think it's horses for courses. You have to think about different things, and you have to allow people to have different identities. And you have to allow companies, for instance, who are in several different jurisdictions, would have different rules, different terms of service according to the laws of the different countries they're in, and they wouldn't want people to be shopping on the website with a different lot of T's and C's from the one where the purchaser is.
Yeah, because you've just identified a cultural difference between Britain and other countries where only a single identity is permitted. Mm.
So I was just going to say, I think there are some much more powerful examples of where unlinkable identities are really important. Just to give a couple of examples. One would be if someone has a medical condition, such as HIV, or say, for example, a psychological problem. In some contexts, knowledge of that is very important. In other contexts, it's irrelevant, but if known, could unduly influence the way that you're dealt with as an individual. Another example might be a past criminal history, for example, where someone, they've had some issue in the past, it's been dealt with, they've done their time. Relevant to necessarily the particular transaction or thing that's going on at that point in time, but in some contexts will be. So I think there are some very real examples that illustrate the fact that there's a need to be able to have different identities that are unlinkable. Now, it might be the case that actually in some cases the same name is known, but at the point of where your identity is used, you can't link those things together.
I think there are very important things like that for victims and people who are suffering from stalking or something like that. People do need to be able to dissociate themselves from a particular identity. As you say, where there is stigma around particular diseases, that's a very important thing, to be able to keep that compartmentalised and separate from their other identity.
A couple more questions.
Louise, just a quick one. How would you feel if rather than different identities, it was different roles? Because we are one person. I understand there are certain circumstances where you would want to separate it, but surely we're acting in different roles rather than necessarily different identities. So I'm a private person always, but when I'm at work, I'm given a role, which is what happens in law, isn't it? You're actually passed a contract that you signed to say that is the role and the delegated authority in which you act.
I think that's quite true. I quite often, when I'm talking about this, talk about personas, and I think perhaps in this audience, a persona would be differently decided, different, more recognised thing. But there are actually some cases where people do need, for various reasons, to disappear and reappear as someone else, and so they do need different
certain
identities.
Services, yes, would need.
Yeah.
Thank you.
John, do you want to?
just a couple of points. Number one, when you're talking about in other countries, many other countries have a unique registry and citizen registry, which, whilst you can have different identity credentials, they're all linked back to exactly the same identity, which is that number, basically, number one. Number two, we mustn't get confused, as said just by the previous speaker, between roles and attributes and identity. You can have different roles, but you are the root identity, as you say, is really the same. There are a couple of things you can. There's a European project called ABC for Trust, attribute-based credentials, where you basically anonymize the credential, but you have you're just known as an attribute. So, for example, I am over 18 is actually your identity on that credential. That's all it says, not name or anything. But even in those cases, there is a capability in that standard, which is going to an ISO standard now being worked on, where there's a capability for escrow for the true identity behind the credential, in case. For a whole range of different reasons, and there's the reasons are listed out as to how and why you actually can execute that escrow. So, for example, you may want to be known as over 18 or something, and then something happens to you, and then they have to find who you are. Let's say if you're ill or taken ill or something like that at the club. So there are possibilities to actually find the identity behind that with appropriate legal safeguards. So there's those roles, those things as well. So I think it's the concept. Oh yes, one other thing. Sorry. In the UK as well, you say you can link identities, but you can also have, interestingly, and I don't know how this works out with IDAP. You can, if you've got two UK passports, which many people that do a lot of travelling do have, where they have different numbers in, how they're linked, I don't know, or how that would actually work out when I'm getting a credential or not from IDAP, I don't know. Something just to think, and I'm sure somebody's thought about it. Thank you very much.
I think escrow is actually a very useful concept. I think I was particularly thinking of identities, and I should have perhaps have called it personas, for different payments, because a lot of people want to make some payments from some source of money and some payments from another source of money, so they don't want all of their payments to be treated in the same way. Again, according to the risk, like I expect many of us here have a credit card with a low value to it, which we use for online payments because we think it's more likely to be compromised, and so we keep that for those payments, and we're not then inconvenienced by our only credit card having been compromised and being without it for some time. So it was in that context that in this particular talk I was talking about it, but I think escrow is a very valuable way of doing it.
Okay, thanks. We're going to have to move on to our last speaker, so if we can thank Louise. And can I now ask Jim Lound from Experian to be the final speaker in this panel?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I've been asked to discuss the challenges and opportunities for identity and attribute providers. So we are currently providing identity assurance services to gov.uk Verify. We have aspirations to allow individuals to assert their identities to the private sector, because we believe that once they've invested in attaining one of these digital identities, whether that's through the Verify scheme or outside the scheme, that they should be able to use that identity with as many organisations as they would like to maximise the benefits in which they've invested. We also want to allow foreign nationals who are new to country to be able to register for a UK digital identity. So that would mean being able to utilise their identity credentials from the country that they've come from. We'd also like to allow foreign nationals to assert their identities that they already have in the country of origin to private sector companies within the UK. So you've got the Spanish person trying to engage with a gaming company in the UK, and we'd like them to be able to utilise their Spanish identity to enable that transaction to take place. We also want to be able to allow individuals to accumulate and manage attributes, their personal attributes. And we believe that as the individual engages with more relying parties utilising their digital identity, that naturally the attributes that are required by the range of relying parties will increase, they will be diverse. So for example, if I'm engaging online with an online retailer, then they'll want to be requesting additional attributes such as delivery address, payment details, that type of thing. So we see that over time, at the will of the individual, if they wish to, that they can accumulate a range of attributes that they can manage and utilise when they feel appropriate. So consequently, we want to enable the individuals to be able to efficiently present the attributes that they want to present to those relying parties in a very efficient way, providing them with the best user experience. So our aim is putting the individual in control of their identities and their attributes and making them more productive online to give them the best experience that they can have to encourage online commerce, both within the UK and across borders. So those are the opportunities. In terms of the challenges, we've already touched upon this, but I think there's, for those individuals that want a digital identity that they can use in all the roles they undertake, so whether they're a citizen, a consumer, an employee or a volunteer, that if they wish, they should be able to use that digital identity in each of those roles. How to get private sector relying parties interested in utilising digital identities, I think, is a challenge. Increasing the take-up of digital identities will help to alleviate that challenge. We have an issue where it's difficult to go to a private sector organisation and say, you should be using these digital identities. And when they turn around and say, well, how many have you got? Well, clearly we're at the start of the programme. And it's only when we get a volume of digital identities established that I think the private sector will start to realise the potential benefits of these digital identities. So increasing the take-up of those digital identities, I think, is a key challenge. Another challenge is addressing the identity evidence issues. So for the younger and the older end of the market, I think that currently is an issue. And also new to country individuals. So from the EU, will those citizens be prepared to use their EU EID as part of an identity proofing process, or to assert their identity to a private sector company in the UK? And from outside of the EU, what evidence can we use, and what evidence can we validate and prove that it's genuine readily online without the need for offline identity proofing processes? Following on from the evidence challenge, we've got document-based metadata that we could potentially utilise from trusted sources. So particularly at the younger end of the market, they may not have current accounts, mortgages and credit cards, but they will have other documentary evidence that they've accumulated, particularly in the education space. So if we could allow the individual to provide consent to access that type of metadata about those documents, then that could contribute towards that identity proofing process. The checking the validity of foreign documents through GDS, we can validate UK passports and driving licenses for the purposes of establishing a gov.uk verify related digital identity. But we cannot easily validate foreign documents such as passports and driving licenses. For those people that don't have electronic-based evidence, is offline identity proofing, is that a commercially viable proposition, and who is in a position to actually provide that offline identity proofing process? And finally, on this section here, access to a wider set of online electronic evidence and attributes. So from government, education and the private sector, how can we release more evidence? Mention's been made of the need to have a credit rating to get one of these digital identities. Well, it's not actually a credit rating you need, it's just that Experian, following the government standards, we choose to use the bureau data that we have, or we allow the individual to give consent to utilise the bureau data. There is nothing in the standards that makes it mandatory to use credit bureau data at all. It's just that that's the way that we choose to utilise it. And I think some of the other identity providers have chosen a similar route as well. Allowing individuals to assert their identity via a call centre and via a face-to-face transaction, I think, is a challenge. As individuals create these digital identities and start to use them on a regular basis, they will become more and more part of their daily lives. And I think they'll expect to be able to utilise them when they're calling a call centre or when they're face-to-face, either having to prove their age or having to prove who they are over a counter, that type of thing. So I think that's a challenge. I think there are services out there, products and services out there that could be utilised. We just need to be able to harness those and make that a reality. I think we also need to look at extending the range of credentials. Our philosophy is that we offer the individual a range of credentials that they find attractive. So they can either sign up to them all or they can sign up to just one. But I think choice is an issue. I think we need to give the individuals choice, and they need to be able to decide under what conditions they use those credentials. So for example, if they sign up to a voice biometric and they happen to be in a very busy place which is very noisy, then they need to be able to say, no, I don't want to use that, I'll use something else that's more appropriate. I think one of the major questions on biometrics is, are consumers yet ready for biometrics? Clearly biometrics have been around for quite a long time now. Certainly in the UK, I don't see major evidence of take-up, but I do think this programme could be the catalyst to allow people to utilise biometrics as a credential if they wish. And then finally, in our experience of dealing with suppliers of services, one of our challenges is to make sure that those services will be compliant with the standards that we're following. So we'd like to see more service providers being T-scheme approved and thereby being able to be readily incorporated into our identity provider service. Thank you very much.